Hi, everybody. And I have to thank you for being brave enough to come to my basement where my computer now is and joining us for Literature Out Loud. And it's going to feature the wonderful words of one of the best writers ever, John Updike, who did a lot of short story writing as well as other things. And two fabulous readers, Pat Holloran and Corey Simpson. Look at them. There they are.
Hi.
We're going to be reading stories from the two ends of John Updike's career. Pat Holloran is going to be reading a piece that was written, maybe one of the first things that John Updike ever got published, from kind of the perspective of a high school person. And then Corey Simpson is going to be reading a piece that was written later in John Updike's life that encompasses a period of time when he was being pursued by people that wanted to write interviews about him. And Corey assures me that this kind of parallels his own experience, which, you might kind of enjoy if you want to know that sort of thing. So I am so pleased to be with Thunder River Theater's generously. Who's barking?
That is my chihuahua.
All right. I love a good bark. So we're going to join ThunderStream courtesy of Thunder River Theater, and we're going to see two ends of John Updike's career. And I think you're going to really love them because they're being read by people that couldn't read them better. So can I turn this over to the wonderful and attractive Pat Holloran? And then we'll be hearing from Corey, and you'll be hearing from me at the end. Thank you, Sean.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This one is called The Happiest I've Been by John Updike. Neil Hovey came for me wearing a good suit. He parked his father's gray Chrysler on the dirt ramp by our barn and got out and stood by the open car door in a double-breasted tan gabardine suit, his hands in his pockets and his hair combed with water, squinting up at a lightning rod an old hurricane had knocked crooked. We were driving to Chicago, so I had dressed in worn-out slacks and an outgrown corduroy shirt. But Neil was the friend I had always been most relaxed with, so I wasn't very disturbed. My parents and I walked out from the house across the low stretch of lawn that was mostly mud after the thaw that had come on Christmas Day, and my grandmother, though I had kissed her goodbye inside the house, came out onto the porch, stooped and rather angry looking, her head haloed by wild old woman's white hair and the hand more severely afflicted by Parkinson's disease, waggling at her breast in a worried way. It was growing dark and my grandfather had gone to bed. Never trust the man who wears the red necktie and parts his hair in the middle, had been his final advice to me. We had expected Neil since mid-afternoon. 19, almost 20, I was a college sophomore home on vacation. That fall, I had met in a fine arts course a girl I had fallen in love with, and she had invited me to the New Year's party her parents always gave and to stay at her house a few nights. She lived in Chicago, and so did Neil now, though he had gone to our high school. His father did something. Sell steel was my impression, a huge man opening a briefcase and saying, "The I-beams are very good this year." That required him to always be on the move, so that at about 13, Neil had been boarded with Mrs. Hovey's parents, the Lancasters. They had lived in Olinger since the town was unincorporated. Indeed, old Jesse Lancaster, whose sick larynx whistled when he breathed to us boys, his shocking and uproarious thoughts on the girls that walked past his porch all day long, had twice been Burgess. Neil's father, meanwhile, got a stationary job, but he let Neil stay to graduate. After the night he graduated, Neil drove throughout the next day to join his parents. From Chicago to this part of Pennsylvania was 17 hours. In the 20 months he had gone, Neil had come east fairly often. He loved driving, and Olinger was the one thing he had that was close to a childhood home. In Chicago, he was working in a garage and getting his overlapping teeth straightened by the Army so they could draft him. Korea was on. He had to go back, and I wanted to go, so it was a happy arrangement. You're all dressed up, I accused him immediately. I've been saying goodbye. The knot of his necktie was loose and the corners of his mouth were rubbed with pink. Years later, my mother recalled how that evening his breath to her stank so strongly of beer she was frightened to let me go with him. Your grandfather always thought his grandfather was a very dubious character, she said then. My father and Neil put my suitcases into the trunk. They contained all the clothes I had brought home, for the girl and I were going to go back to college on the train together, and I would not see my home again until spring. Well, goodbye, boys, my mother said. I think you're both very brave. In regard to me, she meant the girl as much as the roads. Don't you worry, Mrs. Nordholm, Neil said to her quickly. He'll be safer than in his bed. I bet he sleeps from here to Indiana. He looked at me with an irritating imitation of her own fond gaze. When they shook hands goodbye, it was an equality established on the base of my helplessness. His being so slick startled me. But then you can have a friend for years and never really see how he operates with adults. I embraced my mother and over her shoulder tried to take, with the camera of my head, a snapshot I could keep of the house, the woods behind it and the sunset behind them, the bench beneath the walnut tree where my grandfather cut apples into skinless bits and fed them to himself, and the ruts in the soft lawn the bakery truck had made that morning. We started down the half-mile of dirt road to the highway that one way went through Olinger to the city of Alton, and the other way led through farmland to the turnpike. It was luxurious after the stress of farewell to two-finger a cigarette out of the pack in my shirt pocket. My family knew I smoked, but I didn't do it in front of them. We were all too sensitive to bear the awkwardness. I lit mine and held the match for Neil. It was a relaxed relationship. We were about the same height and had the same degree of athletic incompetence and the same curious lack of whatever it was that aroused loyalty and compliance in beautiful girls. But it seemed to me the most important thing about both our friendship and our failures to become, for all the love we felt for women, actual lovers, was that he and I lived with grandparents. This improved both our backward and forward vistas. We knew about the bedside commodes and the midnight coughing fits that awaited most men, and we had a sense of childhoods before 1900, when the farmer ruled the land and America faced west. We had gained a dimension that made us gentle and humorous among peers, but diffident at dances and hesitant in cars. Girls hate boys' doubts. They amount to insults. Gentleness is for married women to appreciate, but this is my thinking then. A girl who has received out of nowhere a gift worth all of Africa's ivory and Asia's gold wants more than just a good guy to bestow it upon. Coming onto the highway, Neil turned right toward Olinger instead of left toward the turnpike. My reaction was to twist and assure myself through the rear window that, though a pink triangle of sandstone stared through the bare treetops, nobody at my house could possibly see. When he was again in third gear, Neil asked, "Are you in a hurry?" No, not especially. Schumann's having his New Year's party 2 days early, so we can go. I thought we'd go for a couple hours and miss the Friday night stuff on the pike. His mouth moved and closed carefully over the dull, silver, painful braces. Sure, I said, I don't care. In everything that followed, there was this sensation of my being picked up and carried. It was 4 miles from the farm to Olinger. We entered by Buchanan Road, driving past the tall white brick house I had lived in until I was 13. My grandfather had bought it before I was born, and his stocks became bad, which had happened in the same year. The new owners had strung colored bulbs all along the front door frame and the edges of the porch roof. Downtown, the cardboard Santa Claus still nodded in the drugstore window, but the loudspeaker on the undertaker's lawn had stopped broadcasting carols. It was quite dark now, so the arches of red and green lights above Grand Avenue seemed miracles of lift. In daylight, you saw the bulbs were just hung from a straight cable by cords of different lengths. Larry Schumann lived on the other side of town, the newer side. Lights ran all the way up the front edges of his house and across the rain gutter. The next door neighbor had a plywood reindeer and sleigh floodlit on his lawn, and a snowman of paper mache leaning tipsily, his eyes were X's, against the corner of his house. No real snow had fallen yet that winter. The air this evening, though, hinted that harder weather was coming. The Schumann's living room felt warm. In one corner, a blue spruce drenched with tinsel reached to the ceiling. Around its pot surged a drift of wrapping paper and ribbon and boxes, a few still containing presents, gloves and diaries and other small properties that hadn't yet been absorbed into the mainstream of affluence. The ornamental balls were big as baseballs, and all either crimson or indigo. The tree was so well dressed I felt self-conscious in the same room with it. Without a coat or tie and wearing an old green shirt too short in the sleeves. Everyone else was dressed for a party. Then Mr. Schumann stamped in comfortingly, crushing us all into one underneath his welcome. Neil and me and the 3 other boys who had showed up so far. He was dressed to go out on the town in a camel top coat and silvery silk muffler, smoking a cigar with the band still on. You could see in Mr. Schumann where Larry got the red hair and white eyelashes and the self-confidence, but what in the son was smirking and pushy was in the father shrewd and masterful. What the one used to make you nervous, the other used to put you at ease. While Mr. was jollying us, Zoe Lessner, a new interest of Larry's and the only other girl at the party so far, was talking nicely to Mrs., nodding with her entire neck and fingering her crest of pearls and blowing cigarette smoke through a corner of her mouth to keep it away from the middle-aged woman's face. Each time Zoe spat out a plume, the shelf of honey hair overhanging her temple bobbed. Mrs. Schumann beamed serenely about her mink coat and rhinestone pocketbook. It was odd to see her dressed in the trappings of the prosperity that usually supported her good nature invisibly, like a firm mattress under a bright, homely quilt. Everybody loved her. She was a prime product of the county, a Pennsylvania Dutch woman with sons, who loved feeding her sons and who imagined that the entire world, like her life, was going well. I never saw her not smile, except at her husband. At last, she moved him into the outdoors. He turned at the threshold and did a trick with his knees and called into us, "Be good, and if you can't be good, be careful." Well, with them out of the way, the next thing was getting liquor. It was a familiar business. Did anybody have a forged driver's license? If not, who would dare to forge theirs? Larry could provide India ink. Then again, Larry's older brother, Dale, might be home and would go if it didn't take too much time. However, on weekends, he often went straight from work to his fiancee's apartment and stayed until Sunday. If worst came to worst, Larry knew an illegal place in Alton, but they really soaked you. The problem is solved, strangely. More people were arriving all the time, and one of them, Cookie Bain, who had been held back one year and hence was deposited in our grade, announced that last November he had become in honest fact 21. I at least gave Cookie my share of the money, feeling a little queasy. Sin had become so handy. The party was the party I'd been going to all my life, beginning with Ann Malin's first Halloween party, which I attended as a hot, lumbering, breathless, and blind Donald Duck. My mother had made the costume, and the eyes kept slipping and were farther apart than my eyes, so that even when the clouds of gauze parted, it was to reveal the frustratingly depthless world seen with one eye. Anne, who, because her mother loved her so much as a child, had remained somewhat childish, and I went another boy and girl who were not involved in any romantic crisis, went down into the Schumann's basement to play circular ping pong. Armed with paddles, we stood each at a side of the table, and when the ball was stroked, ran around it counterclockwise, slapping the ball and screaming. To run better, the girls took off their heels and ruined their stockings on the cement floor. Their faces and arms and shoulder sections became flushed, and when a girl lunged forward toward the net, the stiff neckline of her semi-formal dress dropped away, and the white arcs of her brassiere could be glimpsed cupping fat, and when she reached high, her shaved armpit gleamed like a bit of chicken skin. An earring of Anne's flew off, and the 2 connected rhinestones skidded to lie near the wall among the Schumann's power mower and badminton poles and empty bronze motor oil cans twice punctured by triangles. All these images were immediately lost in the whirl of our running. We were dizzy before we stopped. Anne leaned on me, getting back into her shoes. When we pushed it open, the door leading down to the cellar banged against the newel post of the carpeted stairs going to the second floor. A third of the way up these, a couple sat discussing. The girl, Jackie Island, cried without emotion, the tears and nothing else, like water flowing over wood. Some people were in the kitchen mixing drinks and making noise. In the living room, others danced to records, 78s them, stiff discs stacked in a ponderous leaning cylinder on the spindle of the Schumann's console. Every 3 minutes, with a click and a crash, another dropped and the mood abruptly changed. One moment it would be "Stay as Sweet as You Are." Clarence Lang, with the absolute expression of an idiot, standing and rocking monotonously with June Kaufman's boneless, sad, brown hand trapped in his, and their faces staring in the same direction, pasted together like the facets of an idol. The music stopped. When they parted, a big, squarish, dark patch stained the cheek of each. Then the next moment, it would be Goodman's Loch Lomond or Cherokee. And nobody but Margaret Lento wanted to jitterbug. Nobody but Margaret Lento wanted to jitterbug. She was a former interest of Larry's who was attending the party anyway. She lived outside of Olinger and had come with another girl. Mad, she danced by herself, swinging her head recklessly and snapping her backside. A corner of her skirt flipped a Christmas ball onto the rug, where it shattered into a dozen convex reflectors. Female shoes were scattered in pairs about the room. Some were flats, resting under the sofa, shyly towed in. Others were high heels, lying cockeyed, the spike of one thrust into its mate. Sitting alone and ignored in a great armchair, I experienced within a warm, keen dishevelment, as if there were real tears in my eyes. Had things been less unchanged, they would have seemed less tragic. But the girls who had stepped out of these shoes were, with few exceptions, the ones who had attended my life's party. The alterations were so small: a haircut, an engagement ring, a franker plumpness. While they wheeled above me, I sometimes caught from their faces an unfamiliar glint, off of a hardness I did not remember, as if beneath their skins these girls were growing more dense. The brutality added to the features of the boys I knew seemed a more willed effect, more desired and so less grievous. Considering that there was a war on, surprisingly, many were present, 4F, or at college, or simply waiting to be called. Shortly before midnight, the door rattled, and there, under the porch light, looking forlorn and chilled in their brief athletic jackets, stood 3 members of the class ahead of ours, who in the old days always tried to crash Schumann's party. At Olinger High, they had been sports stars, and they still stood with that well-coordinated looseness, a look of dangling from strings. The 3 of them had enrolled together at Melanchthon, a small Lutheran college at the edge of Alton, and in this season played on the Melanchthon basketball team. That is, 2 did. The 3rd hadn't been good enough. Schumann, out of cowardice more than mercy, let them in, and they hid without hesitation in the basement and didn't bother us, having brought their own bottle. There was one novel awkwardness. Darrell Bechtel had married Emmy Johnson, and the couple came. Darrell had worked in his father's greenhouse and was considered dull. It was Emmy that we knew. At first, no one danced with her, and Darrell didn't know how. But then Schumann, perhaps as host, dared. Others followed, but Schumann had her in his arms most often, and at midnight, when we were pretending the new year began, he kissed her. A wave of kissing swept the room now, and everyone struggled to kiss Emmy. Even I did. There was something about her being married that made it extraordinary. Her cheeks inflamed, she kept glancing around for rescue. But Darrell, embarrassed to see his wife dance, had gone into old man Schumann's den, where Neil sat brooding, sunk in mysterious sorrow. When the kissing subsided and Darrell emerged, I went in to see Neil. He was holding his face in his hands and tapping his foot to a record playing on Mr. Schumann's private phonograph, Krupa's Dark Eyes. The arrangement was droning and circular, and Neil had kept the record going for hours. He loved saxophones. I guess all of us children of that Depression vintage did. I asked him, do you think the traffic on the turnpike has died down by now? He lifted down the tall glass on the cabinet beside him and took a convincing swallow. His face from the side seemed lean and somewhat blue. Maybe, he said, staring at the ice cubes submerged in the ochre liquid. The girl in Chicago's expecting you? Well, yeah, but we can call and let her know once we know. You think she'll spoil? How do you mean? I mean, won't you be seeing her all the time after we get there? Aren't you going to marry her? I have no idea. I might. Well, then, you'll have the rest of Kingdom Come to see her. He looked directly at me, and it was plain in the blur of his eyes that he was sick drunk. The trouble with you guys that have all the luck, he said slowly, is that you don't give a fuck about us that don't have any. Such an assault coming from Neil surprised me, as had his blarney with my mother hours before. In trying to evade his wounded stare, I discovered there was another person in the room. A girl sitting with her shoes on, reading Holiday. Though she held the magazine in front of her face, I knew from her clothes and her unfamiliar legs that she was the friend of Margaret Lento had brought. Margaret didn't come from Olinger, but from Riverside, a section of Alton, not a suburb. She had met Larry Schumann at a summer job in a restaurant, and for the rest of high school, they had more or less gone together. Since then, though, it had dawned on Mr. and Mrs. Schumann that even in a democracy, class distinctions exist. Probably welcome news to Larry. In the cruelest and most stretched out way he could imagine, in the cruelest and most stretched out way he could manage, he had been breaking off with her throughout the year now nearly ended. I had been surprised to find her at this party. Obviously, she had felt shaky about attending and had brought the friend as the only kind of protection she could afford. The other girl was acting just like a guard hired for the night. There being no answer to Neil, I went into the living room where Margaret, insanely drunk, was throwing herself around as if wanting to break a bone. Somewhat in time to the music, she would run a few steps, then snap her body like a whip, her chin striking her chest and her hands flying backwards, fingers fanned as her shoulders pitched forward. In her state, her body was childishly plastic. Unharmed, she would bounce back from this jolt and begin to clap and kick and hum. Schumann stayed away from her. Margaret was small, not more than 5 feet 2 inches. With the smallness, ripeness comes to early. She had bleached a section of her black hair platinum, cropped her head all over, and trained the stubble into short curls like those on antique statues of boys. Her face seemed quite coarse from the front, so her profile was classical unexpectedly. She might have been Portia. When she was not putting on her savage, pointless dance, she was in the bathroom being sick. The pity and the vulgarity of her exhibition made everyone who was sober uncomfortable. Our common guilt in witnessing this girl's rites brought us so close together in that room that it seemed never, not in all time, could we be parted. I myself was perfectly sober. I had the impression then that people only drank to stop being unhappy, and I nearly always felt at least fairly happy. Luckily, Margaret was in a sick phase around 1 o'clock when the elder Schumanns came home. They looked in at us briefly. It was a pleasant joke to see their smiles that, however corrupt and unwinking we felt, to them we looked young and sleepy, Larry's friends. These things quieted after they went upstairs. In half an hour, people began coming out of the kitchen balancing cups of coffee. By 2 o'clock, 4 girls stood in aprons at Mrs. Schumann's sink. And others were padding back and forth, carrying glasses and ashtrays. Another blameless racket pierced the clatter in the kitchen. Out on the cold grass, the 3 Melanchthon athletes had set up the badminton net, and in the faint glow given off by the house were playing. The bird, ascending and descending through uneven bars of light, glimmered like a firefly. Now that the party was dying, Neil's apathy seemed deliberately exasperating, even vindictive. For at least another hour, he persisted in hearing Dark Eyes over and over again, holding his head and tapping his foot. The entire scene in the den had developed a fixity that was uncanny. The girl remained in the chair and read magazines, Holiday and Esquire, one after another. In the meantime, cars came and went and raced their motors out front. Larry Schumann had taken Ann Malin off and didn't come back. That left Zoe Lessner to be driven home by Mr. and Mrs. Bechtel. The athletes had carried the neighbor's artificial snowman into the center of the street and disappeared. Somehow, in the shuffle of arrangements at the end, Neil had contracted to drive Margaret and the other girl home. Margaret was convalescing in the downstairs bathroom. I unlocked a little glass bookcase ornamenting a desk in the dark dining room and removed a volume of Thackeray's works. It turned out to be volume 2 of Henry Esmond. I began it rather than break another book out of the set, which had been squeezed in there so long the bindings had sort of interpenetrated. Henry was going off to war again when Neil finally appeared in the archway and said, "Okay, Norseman, let's go to Chicago." Norseman was a variant of my name he used only when feeling special affection. We turned off all the lamps and left the hall bulb burning against Larry's return. Margaret Lento seemed chastened. Neil gave her his arm and led her back into the back seat of his father's stately car. I stood aside to let the other girl get in with her, but Neil indicated that I should sit in the back. I supposed he realized this left only the mute den girl to go up front with him. She sat well over on her side, was all I noticed. Neil backed into the street and with unusual care steered past the snowman. Our headlights made vivid the fact that the snowman's back was a hollow, right-angled gash. He had been built up against the corner of a house. From Olinger, Riverside was diagonally across Alton. The city was sleeping as we drove through it. Most of the stoplights were blinking green. Among cities, Alton had a bad reputation. Its graft and gambling and easy juries and bawdy houses were supposedly notorious through the middle Atlantic states. But to me, it always presented an innocent face. Row after row of houses built of a local dusty red brick the shade of flower pots. Each house fortified with a tiny awning balustraded porch and nothing but the wealth of movie houses and beer signs along its main street to suggest that its citizens loved pleasure more than the run of mankind. Indeed, as we moved at moderate speed down these hushed streets bordered with parked cars, a limestone church bulking at every corner and the sodium street lamps keeping watch from above, Alton seemed less the ultimate center of an urban region than itself a suburb of some vast mythical metropolis, like Pandemonium or Paradise. I was conscious of evergreen wreaths on door after door and of stained glass fan lights in which each house number was embedded. I was also conscious that every block was one block farther from the turnpike. Riverside, fitted into the bends of the Schuylkill, was not so regularly laid out. Margaret's house was one of a short row, composition shingled, which we approached from the rear down a short cement alley speckled with drains. The porches were a few inches higher than the alley. Margaret asked us if we wanted to come in for a cup of coffee since we were going to Chicago. Neil accepted by getting out of the car and slamming his door. The noise filled the alley, alarming me. I wondered at the easy social life that evidently existed among my friends at 3:30 in the morning. Margaret did, however, lead us in stealthily, and she turned on the only kitchen switch. The kitchen was divided from the living room by a large sofa, which faced into a littered gloom wherein distant light from beyond the alley spilled over the windowsill and across the spines of a radiator. In one corner, the glass of a television set showed. The screen would seem absurdly small now, but then it seemed disproportionately elegant. The shabbiness everywhere would not have struck me so definitely if I hadn't just come from Schumann's place. Neil and the other girl sat on the sofa. Margaret held a match to a gas burner, and as the blue flame licked an old kettle, doled instant coffee into 4 flowered cups. Some man who had once lived in this house had built by the kitchen one window with a breakfast nook. Nothing more than a booth, a table between 2 high-backed benches. I sat in it and read all the words I could see. Salt, pepper, have some lumps, December, Moan's Milk Inc. A very Merry Christmas and joyous New Year. Moan's Milk is safe milk. Mommy, make it Moan's. Matches, Hot Point, Press, McGee's Stove, Federal and Furnace Corp. God is in this house. Ave Maria Grazia Plena. Shredded Wheat. Benefits exciting new pattern comes home. After serving the two on the sofa, Margaret came to me with coffee and sat down beside me in the booth. Fatigue had raised 2 blue welts under her eyes. Well, I asked her, did you have a good time? She smiled and glanced down and made the small vesticle of Jesus. With absent-minded delicacy, she stirred her coffee, lifting and replacing the spoon without a ripple. Rather odd at the end, I said, not even the host there. He took Ann Malin home. Yeah, I know. I was surprised that she knew, having been sick in the bathroom for that hour. You sound jealous, she added. Who does? I do? I don't. You like her, John, don't you? Her using my name and the quality of her question did not, although except for a few parties we had hardly met, seem forward, considering the hour and that she had brought me coffee. There's very little further to go with a girl who has brought you coffee. Oh, I like everybody, I told her. And the longer I've known them, the more I like them, because the more they're me. The only people I like better are ones I've just met. Now, Ann Malin I've known since kindergarten. Every day her mother used to bring her to the edge of the schoolyard for months after all the other mothers had stopped. I wanted to cut a figure in Margaret's eyes, but they were too dark. Stoically, she had gotten on top of her weariness, but it was growing bigger under her. Did you like her then? Well, I felt sorry for her being embarrassed by her mother. She asked me, what was Larry like when he was little? Oh, bright, kind of mean. Was he mean? I'd say so, yes. In some grade or other, he and I began to play chess together. I always won until secretly he took lessons from a man his parents knew and read strategy books. Margaret laughed, genuinely pleased. Then did he win? Well, once. After that, I really tried. And after that, he decided chess was kid stuff. Besides, I was used up. He'd have these runs on people where you'd be down at his house every afternoon. Then in a couple months, he'd get a new pet, and that'd be that. He's funny, she said. He has a kind of cold mind. He decides on what he wants, then he does what he has to do, and nothing anybody says can change him. He does tend to get what he wants, I admitted guardedly, realizing that to her, this meant her. Poor bruised little girl, in her mind, he was all the time cleaving with rare cunning through his parents' objections straight to her. My coffee was nearly gone, so I glanced toward the sofa in the other room. Neil and the girl had sunk out of sight behind its back. Before this, it had honestly not occurred to me that they had a relationship. But now that I saw it, seemed plausible, and at this time of night, good news, though it meant we would not be going to Chicago yet. So I talked to Margaret about Larry, and she responded, showing really quite an acute sense of him. To me, considering so seriously the personality of a childhood friend, as if overnight he'd become a factor in the world, seemed absurd. I couldn't deeply believe that even in her world he mattered much. Larry Schumann, in a little more than a year, had become nothing to me. The important thing, rather than the subject, was the conversation itself. The quick agreements, the slow nods, the weave of different memories. It was like one of those Panama baskets shaped underwater around a worthless stone. She offered me more coffee. When she returned with it, she sat down, not opposite, but beside me, lifting me to such a pitch of gratitude and affection. The only way I could think to express it was by not kissing her, as if a kiss were another piece of abuse women suffered. She said, cold, cheap bastard turns the thermostat down to 60, meaning her father. She drew my arm around her shoulders and folded my hand around her bare forearm to warm it. The back of my thumb fitted against the curve of one breast. Her head went into the hollow where my arm and chest joined. She was terribly small, measured against your own body. Perhaps she weighed 100 pounds. Her lids lowered, and I kissed her 2 lush eyebrows, and then the spaces of skin between the rough curls, some black and some bleached, that fringed her forehead. Other than this, I tried to keep as still as a bed would be. It had grown cold. A shiver starting on the side away from her would twitch my shoulders, then I tried to repress it. She would frown and unconsciously draw my arm tighter. No one had switched the kitchen light off. On Margaret's foreshortened upper lip, there seemed to be 2 pencil marks. The length of wrist my badly fitting sleeve exposed looked pale and naked against the spiraling down of the smaller arm held beneath it. Outside, on the street the house faced, there was no motion. Only once did a car go by, around 5 o'clock, with twin mufflers, the radio on, and a boy yelling. Neil and the girl murmured together incessantly, some of what I could actually overhear. No, which? She asked. I don't care. Wouldn't you want a boy? I'd be happy whatever I got. I know, but which would you rather have? Don't men want boys? I don't care. Somewhat later, Moan's truck passed on the other side of the street. The milkman, well bundled, sat behind headlights in a warm orange volume the size of a phone booth, steering one-handed and smoking a cigar that he set on the edge of the dashboard. When, his wire carrier vibrant, he ran out of the truck with bottles. His passing led Neil to decide the time had come. Margaret woke up frightened of her father. We hissed our farewells and thanks to her quickly. Neil dropped the other girl off at her house a few blocks away. He knew where it was. Sometime during that night, I must have seen this girl's face, but I have no memory of it. She is always behind a magazine or in the dark or with her back turned. Neil married her years later, I know, but after we arrived in Chicago, I never saw him again either. A pre-dawn light touched the clouds above the black slate roofs as, with a few other cars, we drove through Alton. The moon-sized clock of a beer billboard said 10 after 6. Olinger was darkly still. The air brightened as we moved along the highway. The glowing wall of my home hung above the woods as we rounded the long curve by the Mennonite dairy. With a .22, I could have had a pane of my parents' bedroom window, and they were dreaming I was in Indiana. My grandfather would be up, stamping around in the kitchen for my grandmother to make him breakfast, or outside walking to see if any ice had formed on the brook. For an instant, I genuinely feared he might hail me from the peak of the barn roof. Then trees interceded, and we were safe in a landscape where no one cared about us. At the entrance to the turnpike, Neil did a strange thing. He stopped the car and had me take the wheel. He had never trusted me to drive his father's car before, as if my not knowing all the crankshafts and carburetors the way he did would handicap my competence to steer. But now he was quite complacent. He hunched in his gabardine suit under an old Mackinaw and leaned his head against the metal of the window frame and soon was asleep. We crossed the Susquehanna on a long, smooth bridge below Harrisburg, then began climbing toward the Alleghenies. In the mountains there was snow, a dry dusting like sand that waved back and forth on the road's surface. Farther along there had been a fresh fall that night, about 2 inches, and the plows had not yet cleared all the lanes. I was passing a Sunoco truck on a high curve when, without warning, the scraped section gave out, and I realized I might skid into the fence, if not over the edge. The radio was singing Carpets of Clover, I'll Lay Right at Your Feet, and the speedometer said 80. Nothing happened. His Chrysler stayed firm in the snow, and Neil slept through the danger, his face turned skyward and his breath struggling in his nose. It was the first time I had heard a contemporary snore. When we came into tunnel country, the flicker and hollow amplification stirred Neil awake. He sat up, the Mackinaw dropping to his lap, and lit a cigarette. A second after the scratch of his match occurred, the moment of which each following moment was a slight diminution, as we made the long, irregular descent toward Pittsburgh. There were many reasons for my feeling so happy. We were on our way. I had seen a dawn. This far, Neil could appreciate I had brought us safely. Ahead, a girl waited who, if I asked, would marry me. But first there was a vast trip. Many hours and towns interceded between me and that encounter. There was the quality of the 10 a.m. sunlight as it existed in the air ahead of the windshield, filtered by the thin, overcast, blessing irresponsibility. You felt you could slice forever through such a cool, pure element, and springing by implying how high these hills had become. A wide-spreading pride. Pennsylvania, your state, as if you had made your life. And there was knowing that twice since midnight, a person had trusted me enough to fall asleep beside me.
The actor's tour had taken him to a Midwestern city 15 miles from the small town where he had grown up, and an interviewer called suggesting that they visit there together. It would provide, he said, an angle. The newspaper the interviewer worked for was the only one left in the city, and this gave it an aura of absolute power, of final opportunity. The actor was at that awkward age, almost too old for romantic leads, but not old enough for character parts. Opportunity, his agent had more than once told him, doesn't knock forever. He could use the publicity. I can't stand interviews, he said. The prospective interviewer said nothing, just waited. They're so intrinsically imprecise, the actor went on. So sadly prurient. The presence on the other end of the line stuck to its silence. The female exclamations of another conversation faintly wafted into the braided wires. Okay, the actor said, and they set a time to meet on the hotel parking lot. The interviewer stood beside a little mustard-colored car. He wore dun bell-bottoms and a denim jacket cut as short as a waiter's jacket. He was a trim, tight young man with an exceptionally small mouth and wiry black hair that had about it, without being exactly kinky, a glisten of contained energy, a kind of silent acrylic crackle that declared it would never decompose. There would be no mercy, the actor saw. He would have to watch what he said as carefully as if he were in court. Unfortunate words had a way of passing into print from a single absent-minded nod, politely granted an impudent question. The actor had a number of former wives, each equipped with vigilant lawyers, and he moved through the dark skies of private life, it sometimes seemed to him, like a comet trailing stiff white envelopes of legal stationery. So, no politeness today, no ridiculous givingness, no charming sharing of indiscretions with this person to whom he was not a person, after all, but a name, an object to be exploited, a walking slag heap to be sifted for ore one more time. Would you like me to drive so you can take notes? The actor asked. He was a big-boned, coarse-skinned man offstage, and he took pleasure in menacing at the outset with such extravagant cooperation, his wiry little persecutor. Why, yes, that might be nice, come to think of it. The car was a Japanese model, as cunning and tawdry as a music box. It had 4 forward gears and a reverse tucked somewhere in the lower right quadrant, where New Zealand is on a map. The dashboard hummed and spelled out monosyllables of instruction and warning. The actor felt clumsy. I don't drive much anymore, he explained. I'm just dragged around by these limousines. What about at your summer place in Amagansett? The interviewer asked, having already produced a notebook. My last wife got that, as you probably know. The place, the Porsche, the works. No, I didn't know, the man wrote busily. Don't put that in, Christ, the actor begged, shifting from first gear straight into fourth with a fearful laboring of the engine. It's on the record, isn't it, elsewhere? Well, let's not put it on again. Makes it look as though I have nothing else to talk about. Of course, the interviewer said. He put the notebook away and gazed out the window. The actor didn't like this swift, prim docility either. It seemed stagey. From the side, the other man's mouth was a mere irritated nick in his profile. He resented having been ousted from the driver's seat. This wasn't meant to be so much a personal piece about you and your affairs, the interviewer said, as about the place. You, in regard to the place you grew up in. It's not much of a place. That was its charm, the actor said, and added, don't put that in either. The miles went by. Inner suburbs gave way to outer, and then there was something like countryside, behind the roadside gas stations and the old stone farmhouses with reflecting balls in their front yards. The interviewer sat silent in what seemed to be a sulk. The strange impression grew upon the actor that this man had been a high school athlete, a second baseman, quick on the pivot and pesky at the plate. Determined to be entertaining, to charm away the sulk, the actor talked about the play he was in, leading actresses he had worked with, his theories of stagecraft, his philosophy of professional ups and downs. The interviewer kept his notebook tucked away. The little automobile had become quite responsive to the actor's touch and began to swing along curves he knew by heart, having driven them as a child, first with his father at the wheel and then with himself in control. Of course, the actor explained as they approached the town limits, all this was trees and fields then. That mall didn't exist. That mess of ticky-tacky houses over there was just a dairy farm with a little creek that ran through a pasture where my mother's quainter relatives used to gather watercress. There was a dam and a pond back in there where the tough boys and the pretty girls used to go swimming. I never did. My mother thought I might drown or lose my virginity or have people think I did, which would be even worse. Uh-huh, the interviewer said, as though he had heard this before. Don't put that in about my mother and virginity, the actor asked. She still has cousins in the area, in nursing homes mostly. There used to be a diner here, he announced abruptly, that stayed open all night. At 2 a.m, you could go in there after a date, all lightheaded and your face full of lipstick, and eat a hamburger. That was my idea of the sophisticated life, eating a hamburger at 2 a.m. A man called Smokey Moser ran it. He never seemed to sleep. We kids loved him like a father, you could say. He was the father I yearned for. Is that a fact? I exaggerate a little. Smokey was okay, though. Died young of some disease nobody would ever name. Better skip that, he may have a widow. Grudgingly, the interviewer had got out his notebook and made a few notes. The gravel lot that had surrounded the diner was occupied now by a great cube of brown-tinted glass, the branch of a statewide bank. Yellow arrows painted on the smooth asphalt told automobiles how to proceed to the drive-in windows. The actor studied the faces of the people moving in and out of the bank and recognized none of them, though there was something he did recognize, a tone, a pallor and density of flesh in their arms and faces, a way of suddenly looking behind and above them, unsmilingly, fearing the worst out of the sky, the weather of the world. Up here, there was a feed mill where some of the faster girls had supposedly let it be done to them, that fabled thing in the weedy area between 2 asbestos-shingled walls. The actor was surprised after the more than a decade since he had last visited by how sexy the town was, how saturated with love and that psychosomatic quickening which love brings. The cotton wool sky, the heavy dusty trees, the very tone of dull red in the bricks arrived in unison at something like one's own exact body temperature. Surrounded by farm country, it was a kind of hill town, divided in the middle by an avenue that followed the curve of an abandoned railroad bed. The town's lower part, south of the avenue, had been built solid in the years just before the Depression in rows of brick semi-detached houses with symmetrical big living room windows and square-pillared front porches. There was a security here in these ruddy rows, block after block, each with its little apron of terraced lawn and 2 concrete steps leading up to the first terrace and little pansy beds or barberry hedges along the walk. The rectilinear, repetitive streets were high-crowned, and the actor was made to remember the rhythm imparted to a car, the soft braking and dipping as the intersections were cautiously traversed. Many an afternoon, many a Sunday, he had cruised these streets in his parents' old tan Dodge, and then in the navy blue Chrysler with the iridescent touched-up patch on the fender, looking for action, for a familiar car parked outside a house he knew, which might single an afternoon of canasta or an evening of laughing at Liberace or the roller derby on that new toy called television. Any excuse for a party wherever 2 or 3 got together. This side of town hasn't changed much at all, he told the interviewer. How could it? They didn't leave any vacant lots. Each of the thick-set duplexes was like a married couple, it occurred to him now. The rumblings and spats on one side of the wall impossible not to hear on the other. For some reason, the actor said, the terrific-looking girls all tended to live over in this section. My family lived in a house all alone on its lot on the older side of town. There's a distinct change once you cross the avenue. The houses, a lot of them, are wood. And look, how can I say, gaunt, pinched, scary, even. Don't put that in. He steered the nimble little car through a stoplight that hadn't been there 30 years ago and drove uphill, out of the cozy, low-lying area of red brick rows into the slanting neighborhood where he had been raised. That used to be a barber shop, he said, driving up Liberty Street. You can still see the striped pole, though Jake's been dead for years now. Apoplexy, if memory serves. Can you spell it? Haircuts. The long wait and then the sitting so still as metal gnashed across your scalp had filled the actor as a child with a gloom and suspense bordering on terror. There had been a big plate glass window, and as the scissors interminably clicked, the sunshine and the traffic on the other side had seemed an unattainable paradise. Now that big window held Venetian blinds and a sign proclaiming that gold and silver could be bought and sold here. He suddenly remembered the octagonal green and cream pattern of the linoleum floor dotted with hair clippings where Jake would tap dance. Not tap dance, perhaps, but do a spry and comical shuffle and slide on that slick floor. Jake had hated Roosevelt. The thought of the man had made him apoplectic, and in the fury of his shrill tirades must have felt the danger of driving customers away, for he would suddenly relent and change the poisoned subject and go into his little comical steps, sometimes with the broom as partner. And where you see that marquee with bingo on it was the old movie house, where I learned to dream, the actor said. To dream and to pose, you could put it. Actually, the sign said INGO, and the look of disuse in its new role as a gambling hall had overtaken the theater. The old glass cases where the movie posters, Alan Ladd, Lana Turner, Lassie, had been different every week, were empty of any advertisement and had been defaced with illegible spray-painted swirls. Which was your house? The interviewer asked. That one. Which one? You missed it. It looks just like the ones around it. I thought you said it stood so alone on its lot. They were small lots. Why was he being perverse, the actor wondered, denying this infielder the small intrusion of gazing upon his averagely shabby and plain birthplace? Was it that the house itself, in his own quick glimpse of it, seemed to beg that he not give it away? It was wearing a new color of paint, a bright lime green, like a desperate disguise. Or was it that he himself was ashamed of it, because in fact had not been just like the ones around it? The house had been and still was slightly smaller than its flanking neighbors, those better kept and higher gabled houses owned in his boyhood by the Baines and the Murchisons, who looked down on them, his mother had felt, because his father worked with his hands, because his father was unemployed, because his father came home drunk and could be heard cursing out on the lawn. There were many reasons why the Baines and the Murchisons might look down on them. The actor's furtive glance had not been so quick, however, that he did not spy in the shrubbery around the front porch, with its jigsawed banister uprights, the invisible ghosts that had kept him company when he hid there where the earth had been too packed and sheltered to give weeds a purchase, like a hard floor. The spaces between the bushes had been like a set of little rooms only he lived in and where he entertained voices. Who had these presences been that had spoken back to the voice inside his head? They were still there, crowded around the porch, calling out to him. There were even a few at the side of the house where his mother had tried to grow peonies against the brick foundation, and it had proved too shady. Or had she planted the roots too deep? Mrs. Bain told her mother she had, and they didn't speak for a year. Imagine, his mother had said, her spying down on me from those parlor windows and not saying a word until it was too late and the peonies were dug in. The cement walk-along here in the shadows used to accumulate anthills in the cracks as well as neighborhood bitterness. Out back, there had been a sandbox, and its little ridges had been dunes in the Sahara, and the green lead tanks had been chasing Rommel. The voices the actor had heard while playing in the sandbox had been different. They had been news voices broadcast from overseas. You said you learned to dream and to pose in the movie house, the interviewer prompted. They were driving down another block, and his old home was sealed safe behind them. And in the high school, the actor said. I'll take you by it. They built it up on top of the hill. The only thing higher in town is the cemetery. Here's a confession for you. You like confessions, don't you? That terrible silence. I had terrible acne as a kid, from about 14 on. Just like my father, he was all pockmarked. Well, when I put on makeup for some assembly play in about 9th grade, my own skin disappeared. For as long as I was on stage, I was like everybody else. I was human. So I said to myself, hey, the actor's life for me. Many adolescent boys have acne, don't they? There seemed a reprimand in this, a callback to relativity. I don't know, did you? Not so bad, actually. Well, then, I bet you were quite a smooth jock in your time. Well, I was... Don't be modest. You played second base, didn't you? Center field, usually. Same idea. Anyway, I didn't care what the other boys had. They were them and I was me. Leave that grammar just the way I said it. Yes. I don't know that I can use everything you say. You've already been quite generous with your time. Also, I loved having a role. It wasn't just the makeup. The whole role was like a mask, a spiritual mask I was safe behind. If people laughed, it wasn't at me exactly. I loved to hear them laugh. Let's hear you laugh. Silence. Come on, for me. It was a dry, embarrassed laugh. I love it, the actor complimented him. There you see the high school, the old-style Roman pillars and all. They say when you come back to a place, things look smaller, but it looks bigger than ever to me. It looks huge. I hear they don't have students to fill it now. He swung in the corner racily. This little bug really has some zip, doesn't it? There used to be a variety store here with the steps at an angle and the little overhang and paper pumpkins in the windows at the appropriate time of year, and then Christmas cards and Easter eggs. It was a kind of 3D calendar you could walk into and take a stool. There was a counter we could sit up at and smoke and look at ourselves smoking in the mirror. I bet you never smoked, did you? No. As you guessed, I was big into sports. God, I used to smoke. Anything to keep a mask in front of my face. It's gone now, the store. The new owners had painted everything white, even the display windows, so no one could look in. Somebody must be living behind those blank windows. The people who had descended upon the town to live in it since the actor had left were aliens from space. He could not imagine their lives. Now we're getting into a part of town that was new then. Rich houses, we thought they were, though they don't look so rich now. The section was called Oak Slope. To live in Oak Slope was about the ritziest thing I could imagine. To live in Oak Slope and have huge closets of clothes with a different corduroy shirt for every day of the week. Corduroy shirts, that dates me. And we used to wear reindeer sweaters. I don't suppose you know what a reindeer sweater was, do you? I can imagine. I'm not sure you can. The sharp guys, there was a word then, snazzy. S-N-A-Z-Z-Y, the snazzy guys whose fathers sold real estate or were foremen at the mill, owned a lot of them, beautifully knitted, with different things. It wasn't just reindeer, snowflakes, butterflies. They're still around. It's not the same. I used to wear the ones I had inside out some days as if it was another sweater. It didn't fool anybody, but it made me feel slightly, you could say, snazzy. I'll be honest about it. I was pathetic. More than that, I was obnoxious, with acne yet. Just driving around Oak Slope makes me feel obnoxious. How am I acting? He got no answer. Now, down here, the actor announced, this curving street, when I was a lad, another funny old-fashioned word, L-A-D, past the last new house built, there used to be a kind of dirt road that didn't go anywhere much and was a great place to park if you had a girl. At the age of 17, he had acquired a girl, Irma Jean Willis. For heaven's sake, the actor exclaimed without acting, his exclamation honest. It's still here. I would have thought it had been built up ages ago. The necking place. The spatial feeling of the spot, with a tall bank of earth on one side, freshly bulldozed then and still rather raw and scraggly now, and a lower rise on the other side, deep green from the time when this had been a hillside hayfield, was unaltered, uncorrupted, sexy. In his excitement, the actor braked. The interviewer glanced over, worried. Amazing, said the actor, spacing his syllables. Back in performance. I wonder if it's still used. I see a few beer bottles, said the interviewer uneasily. You don't understand what a lovely surprise this is. For a space like this to last in modern America, the cops used to check it out once in a while and shine a flashlight in the windows. The little unpaved road that generations of furtive, love-craving cars had worn into the earth continued for a few yards between the two sheltering, grassy shoulders and then dipped down to rejoin a side street called Button. Button led into Maple. Maple crossed the avenue, and 2 more blocks took you into Sycamore. Ermagene used to live at the corner of Sycamore and Pierce. A kind of hazy warmth, as when he would show up after midnight at Smokey's Diner, had been laid across the actor's face. Without his realizing it, the little Japanese car had under his hands driven itself along the remembered route into that inviting red realm of the 2 family brick houses and rows. The cars had come to the corner of Pierce and Sycamore, to the big house whose retaining walls were ornamented with mossy concrete balls, and whose side entrance was a set of steps with an iron railing he had often grasped. He softly braked. She would come down those very steps for a date, all starchy and perfumed and hopeful, though what had he had to offer her but a second-run movie and an ice cream soda afterwards? As she hurried across the street to the old Chrysler with the patched fender, her pastel dress would be flattened against her thighs by her hurrying, by the soft wind she made in her haste to be with him. My girlfriend used to live here, he confessed to his interviewer. You had only one? Well, yes. How many do you recommend? I thought I was lucky to have even one. She was a grade behind me at school, and after I graduated, I lost track of her. Married, I suppose, somewhere. The actor was incredulous that the interviewer could be blind to the glory around them, the railings and retaining walls and little lap-like lawns of these solid, unchanging homes, rose that at any moment might release Ermagine, racing lightly toward them with her hair in barrettes and her round young legs tipped by the kind of open-toed white heels women in Hollywood comedies wore. Jean Arthur, Rosalind Russell. The actor felt swamped by love. He was physically sickened to think that such a scene had once been real and that a self of his had been there to play a part. His foot eased the clutch back in and the car moved off reluctantly. "Let me show you some more of the town," he offered. "There's a quarry where we used to ice skate, and a playground. A block from here where they put the new annex on the town hall, there used to be the strangest little structure, something like out of Disneyland, a sort of stone tower where you paid your water bills." Ermagine loved butter pecan ice cream, he remembered, in a vanilla soda, and always debated with him whether she should have an onion on her hamburger. If he would, she would. And her skin. All of his life since, he had been dealing with women who were doctoring their skins, vitamin E cream, pancake makeup, moisturizers. Ermagine's skin had been utterly neutral in shade, neutral and natural, tinted by nothing, pure, trusting female skin beneath her pastel clothes. The actor's face felt hot. He wanted to cruise forever through this half of town, the car dipping in a kind of obeisance at every intersection. The interviewer cleared his throat and said, "I think I maybe have seen enough. This is only for a sidebar, you know." "Wait, how about coming with me to my old luncheonette and having a bite to eat? How about some butter pecan ice cream?" The other man laughed, stiffly, as when commanded to laugh before. "And then there's a time problem," he said. "If I don't get this in tonight, your show won't still be around." "That's okay. The luncheonette is a flower shop now anyway. Please don't let my old girlfriend's... please don't put my old girlfriend's name in the article." "You never mentioned it." "Ermagine Willis. Ermajean. Isn't that a wonderful, funky name?" "Maybe it'd be easier if I drove now?" "No. Keep your pencil out, you son of a bitch. I'm going to tell you the name of every family that used to live in this entire block."
Oh, my word. Yeah.
Actors!
I have to say, if that doesn't span a man's career about writing his high school days, I don't know what does. And beautifully read. Gentlemen, I can't thank you enough. John Updike, my friends, I recommend him because he can lyrically write a passage about someone's life like nobody else has ever done. And you owe it to yourself to read it. And we are so glad we got to hear it because it was presented so beautifully. Thank you very, very much.
And thank you, Janice.
Yeah, thank you for having us, Janice. Just really quickly, on behalf of Thunder River Theater Company, I really just want to thank you again for doing this program and keeping it going during COVID. And I want to thank Pitkin County Library, Friends of the Library as well, for continuing this and offering actors throughout the valley these opportunities to keep being creative when there's so much not happening out there still. So thank you so much, Janice.
Oh, I'm so glad I get to do it. I'm thankful to the library, and I'm ever so thankful to you because we would be way dead in the water without Thunder River Theater. And I'm so lucky that I get to work at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, being a historical enactor. I get to keep working, but I get to keep doing this and presenting these beautiful words, because if we don't keep literature at the forefront and continue to cherish it, we're losing such a wealth that humankind has, and I really am glad we get to do it. Yay for that. And that being said, next month, we get to hear the wonderful words of Amy Bloom, who is a beautiful author as well as being a psychotherapist. And she has written wonderful words, which I have given myself permission to read one of the stories, and the beautiful Eileen Seeley will get to read another one. So that will be on the third Wednesday in March, just one moment. And that will be the 17th of March. Same bat time, same bat channel. And we'd love to see you. And gentlemen, I'd love to have you read to me every night of my life. Thank you so much.
To put you to sleep, right?
Yeah, well, there was a moment of that, but thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all.
And,
Thank you. Good to
thank
see you,
you,
Pat.
Thunder River, for the opportunity. And thank you, Sean Jeffries, for making us look good. Hey,
Absolutely.
so don't give up on us. We're continuing on.
Thanks so much.
We'll look for you next month.
Bye, everybody.